What's up, folks? Jacob Sipkin from TZ Strength here, doing a little Q&A for Renaissance Periodization CrossFit athletes. So we had about 4 questions that we're going to go over today. The first one is, are cutting and massing phases beneficial for CrossFit athletes? So the obvious answer is that this depends on the athlete. What you want to keep in mind is that cutting and massing phases are the most beneficial way to accurately control whether you're gaining or losing weight, rather than just staying in sort of a maintenance phase where your body weight equalizes. That might work out, but having distinct cutting and massing phases allows you a greater degree of control. However, something you really got to keep in mind is that there are better and worse times to take that approach. So what are the best times to affect your body composition intentionally? During the off season. If you want to gain or lose weight, that's going to come with mental and physical adaptations that are going to take some time, and also strategic and tactical adaptations. So whether you get bigger or smaller, you're going to have to change the way you approach workouts, the way you break up reps, and that's going to take some time to get used to. It also just takes time to get used to feeling differently. That might mean changes in body angles that when you're setting up things like your snatch and your clean and your deadlift that affect you. It might mean being comfortable going for bigger sets on body weight movements where you not have been comfortable doing that at a heavier body weight. Either way, the best time to make those kind of changes is early in the season or in the off season when the competition phase is over, so that you have time to make adaptations like that before the next competition season begins. A couple common mistakes. While cutting, the most common mistake is doing too much conditioning, in particular just adding senseless volume. The control of your caloric intake is going to be the most important aspect of calorie balance. More training might help, but it might also cause a problem. It might make you hungrier than you would be otherwise without any real payoff in terms of creating a larger caloric deficit. And it might just be hard to sustain. It might lead to injury. So if you are cutting, avoid doing too much conditioning and just too much volume in general. Don't do volume for volume's sake. While massing, by far the most common and biggest mistake is doing too little conditioning, and in particular, avoiding low-intensity, steady-state conditioning. Low-intensity, steady-state conditioning is really low impact. It doesn't have much impact on the rest of your training, so it'll let you keep up good heavy lifting, whereas doing stuff like high-intensity intervals, especially on bike and prowler, stuff like that, is going to really be fatiguing, and it's going to affect you in a much more similar way to lifting, so it's going to make it harder to get good lifting workouts in. A really important aspect of keeping low-intensity steady-state cardio in when you're doing a mass is that as you build more muscle mass, that mass is going to need to be perfused with capillaries. You need to improve mitochondrial density, and it's going to be harder to do that if you put on 5 or 10 pounds of lean mass. It's harder to do all that after the fact, but if you can keep your low-intensity steady-state cardio going as you gain that size, it's going to be a lot easier. You're going to find that you're in better condition with that weight. Now, obviously, it can be done other way, and there is, of course, an upper limit. You don't want to do so much that it impedes your ability to gain size, but don't forego it completely. Don't forget your conditioning. Remember that if you're a CrossFit athlete, you're gaining mass in order to get better at your sport, and that means that you need to perfuse that mass with the ability to be as aerobically manageable as possible. So the next question we had was, why do some people get really jacked, get big and muscular doing CrossFit, and others don't? The obvious answer is genetics, right? So genetics, age, diet, training frequency, training consistency, regardless of what you're doing, whether you're doing CrossFit or bodybuilding or anything else, those things are going to play a huge role in how you end up looking. But that's not really particularly helpful. It's not actionable. It's just the way things are. So why do some people get jacked doing CrossFit and others don't, within the scope of things we can control? We should first address the fact that the term CrossFit is very, very broad. It's almost like a catch-all term. 2 programs might reasonably qualify as CrossFit, yet be very, very different, with one being far better suited to building strength and mass than the other. So with that in mind, what are some things you can do to ensure that your program is good at building muscle and making you jacked? The most obvious one is Make sure that you're including regular progressive strength training, big heavy compound lifts, squatting, deadlifting, pressing exercises. Nothing really builds muscle as well as those things. It's also going to be really, really important for the sport aspect of CrossFit, or even if you're just doing CrossFit recreationally for fitness, being strong is really important. Include accessory and supplementary work. That's very, very important. It's not only going to help you be stronger, it's also probably going to help you be a healthier athlete. I'm thinking here of stuff like variations of the main lifts, like using pauses and tempos. I'm thinking here of accessory movements like rows and unilateral work. I'm also thinking of more traditional bodybuilding type movements like direct bicep and tricep work, direct hamstring and quad and midline work. That kind of stuff is going to make a big difference in your ability not only to gain mass, but to stay healthy and to move well. Finally, strict gymnastics movements, particularly for upper body mass, are going to be really, really helpful. They're going to make your upper body much stronger, and again, they're going to have a lot of carryover. So making sure that those three things are standard ops in your program, that is regular progressive strength training, a good, well-rounded supplementary program, and strict gymnastics practice, they're all going to help you be not only more jacked, but a better rounded athlete. We had a question about CrossFit and competitive endurance sports. So the question was essentially, how do you balance competing in endurance sports? I think the person was talking about cycling. I'm going to speak a little more generally here. Balancing competing in endurance sports and doing CrossFit. So there's two ways to address this question. I wasn't sure which one was being asked, but I wanted to kind of answer both because they're both very viable and good questions. One is to address the question as, I'm competing in both CrossFit type competitions and endurance sports. The other is, I'm a endurance athlete using CrossFit to supplement my endurance sport training. So those are obviously two very different things. I should make the disclaimer here, I'm not an endurance coach. I've never coached, an athlete through more than fairly run-of-the-mill performances in half marathons and marathons, and that was CrossFitters who decided to go and do this. So it's certainly not my area of expertise. I'm going to avoid specifics in terms of recommending how to go about the training. I'm going to stick to sort of some general ideas. So let's take first the athlete who's competing both in CrossFit and in endurance sports. In this kind of situation, one of the most important things you got to address is the careful selection of your competition schedule, right? So by selecting when you compete in each sport, we can then modify training cycles in such a way that allow us to get the most out of our training for each different sport. There's two potential approaches that I can see here. One is to make the two competitions pretty discrete. So here I would say you would aim for at least 12 weeks before an endurance competition and a functional fitness competition. Ideally even a little bit longer, so you kind of have some downtime between those two events. You don't want to be going from one straight to the other ideally. You don't want to go from 12 weeks of training for a big race straight into 12 weeks of training for a fitness competition. What this is going to do is allow you to have training cycles that are a little more discrete with a heavy emphasis on one of the two sports while the other is in maintenance mode. So you'd be training 12 weeks where the heavy focus is on your cycling or whatever sport you're doing. There's a lot of the volume there, and you kind of have your CrossFit training on maintenance. Doesn't mean you stop doing it, but it would definitely, take the back seat. The other option is to consolidate the competitions really tightly. So you might have a CrossFit event one weekend and a race the next weekend, or vice versa. There's going to be some pros and cons here. You're going to have more concurrent training cycles. It's likely that the stress and volume of each training cycle will be higher. It's also probably going to make it a little bit harder to structure your training in such a way that you're getting as much as possible out of your training for each event. However, the pro is that it's going to allow you more downtime between training cycles. So that is to say, rather than going, okay, I'm 12 weeks on for this race, and now I get maybe a week or two off to kind of relax, and then I'm right back into training for this next competition. So there's pros and cons there. How to decide between the two approaches, I would say, is mostly going to be down honestly to psychology. If you're the type of person who feels like you can sustain a pretty high level of training year-round, it doesn't stress you out psychologically too much, then it might be a good idea to just separate your competitions by a decent chunk of time so that you're able to so that you're able to train for one, train for the other. If you're somebody who gets really stressed out by hard training and you feel like you need bigger chunks of downtime, then maybe consolidate the competitions so that it allows you to have a little bit more time between events, and you're able to have a little bit more downtime and be relaxed and sort of switch off before going back into competition mode. The other possibility is that we're talking about an athlete using CrossFit or CrossFit-style training as a complement to their endurance sports. So if we're doing that, there's three major questions we need to address. We need to address the question of scheduling, we need to address the question of frequency, and we need to address the question of content. So we want to answer all these in the light that the endurance sport is the priority. So with regards to schedule, what does that mean? It means that the schedule should be designed to minimally interfere with your sport-specific training. Depending on how many days a week you are training for your sport, there's a lot of different ways this can look. First of all, it might mean taking your GPP sessions, your CrossFit sessions, whatever you want to call them, and doing them always before a rest day. So if you're training 4 days a week, let's say you train Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, then maybe you always want to make sure that those CrossFit sessions are never on Fridays because you have 2 days training in a row. Maybe you want to always do it when you have a day off the next day. That's one way to consider scheduling that kind of thing. It might mean always doing your GPP workout as the second session of the day. So if you're doing double days, make sure it's always done after the primary sports session. And it might just have to do with selecting and ordering exercises in such a way that it reduces interference with your sport-specific training. That's especially important if you're going to be doing your GPP sessions prior to, whether on the same day or the prior day, to an important sport training session. Frequency. I would say in almost all cases, 3 days a week is plenty for frequency for your GPP work. At earlier stages of development, so that is to say if the athlete is relatively new to their sport, if they're just a young athlete, then it may be the case that more GPP is necessary. But do keep in mind that more than 3 days a week is probably going to make it pretty hard to schedule your GPP in such a way that it doesn't interfere over much with your sport-specific training. Finally, we have content. So GPP is general physical preparation. The content of your GPP training is going to differ dependent on your level of development relative to your athletic potential. So it's important to remember here that just because GPP is general doesn't mean that it can't be specific in certain ways. So I don't want to comment here on the specifics of content for GPP for endurance sports because, like I said, it's not my specialty, but there's a few really important ideas to keep in mind when you're selecting content for general physical prep. The more advanced the athlete is, the more specific their general prep needs to be to their sport. So as an example, let's take weightlifting, the sport of weightlifting. If you are a brand new weightlifter, especially if you're young, you're 14 years old, you're just learning how to lift, your GPP needs to be really broad. You should just be trying to get generally fit. I would even say in this kind of situation, a pure CrossFit program with some focus on really developing weightlifting technique is a great way to go. Ilya Ilyin, one of the best weightlifters in the world, I want to say I heard the story from Chad Smith of Juggernaut. Ilya told Chad that when he was a kid, he would go to the gym and just do all the exercises, is what he said. He would play with barbells, play with weights, but he would do gymnastics, he would swim, he would run, all that kind of stuff. So when you have an athlete who is relatively new to the sport, and especially if they're young, they need a really broad base of GPP. But the more advanced the athlete is, the more specific their GPP needs to be. So whereas for a 14-year-old brand new weightlifter, general physical preparation is very general. For somebody who's been lifting for 10 years, they're in their mid-20s, which is generally the peak age for male weightlifters, general physical prep is just going to look like back squatting sets of 10 instead of front squatting sets of 2, right? Obviously very sport specific, building strength and muscle mass in ways that are highly specific to the sport. In endurance sports, it's kind of the same thing. If you have an advanced athlete, let's say a 800-meter runner, what are they doing in their off-season? They're running. They're probably running longer distances, getting their base miles in, building up their work capacity, but they're still running and running is obviously specific to running. So dependent on your level of development in the sport, keep in mind that the content of your GPP is either going to be more general or less general. It's also really important to keep in mind that if any particular element of your general physical prep can be traced to any detraction in your sport-specific prep, then that aspect of your GPP is inappropriate. So that is another way of saying GPP cannot take away from sport-specific prep, because sport practice is necessarily the most important thing we do. So there's a lot of different ways that can happen, but they mostly fall under one of two categories, which I would call direct detraction and indirect detraction. Something is directly detracting from your sport-specific training if it leads to like maladaptations for the sport. So an example would be weightlifters probably shouldn't do a lot of really slow tempo work because over time that can lead to maladaptations, which make them really good at controlling weight slowly but not so good at being super explosive, which is what weightlifters need to do. We also have indirect detraction, which is not necessarily causing maladaptations, but is, for example, fatiguing the athlete in such a way or to such a degree that it interferes with their sport-specific training. So if your main sport is cycling and your GPP involves doing tempo squat sets of 10, which just blow your quads out, and when you get on your bike, you can't hit the requisite intensity or pace for your workout, then you might want to consider that reconsider that aspect of your GPP, as it seems to be detracting more than it's contributing to your training. Finally, peaking for CrossFit competitions. I was asked in particular to provide an example of how I peak my athletes for regionals. So the basic structure of our regionals peak, we're just going to go with the week of the competition. It would be a little too much to go over 3 or 4 weeks here. But the basic structure of the regionals peak. On Monday, we're more or less going to train normally, normal volume, but it's going to be pretty event focused. They're going to be focusing on the things they need to do at the weekend. However, there's 2 things we're going to try to avoid. One, we're going to try to avoid anything that we think is likely to tear the athlete's hands. If you tear a callus on Monday, especially if it's a bad tear, there's a decent chance it's not healed by Friday. We want to carefully avoid that. The second thing we want to avoid is if we know any particular movement or movement pattern is prone to making the athlete very sore. We want to avoid that because even if the soreness clears up by the first day of competition on Friday, there's a possibility that it'll impact the last few days of training. We want the athlete feeling good. We don't want them worrying or stressing about, oh man, it's Wednesday and I'm still pretty sore. How am I going to feel come game day on Friday? We want to avoid that. There might be some tweaking there if the athlete needs to practice a specific event and it has a movement that makes them sore. We have to play with that a bit. But those are the 2 things I always try to keep in mind. Tuesday, the volume's going to come down. We're still going to train pretty hard. We'll do events, specific event practice, but we'll aim for lower impact events. By impact, I mean the impact on the athlete's total fatigue. So if there's a shorter event or an event that's not as hard, we might be doing stuff like if there's a max snatch, we'd be doing some snatch work that day because it's not prone generally to making the athlete particularly sore. We're going to do event skill work. So let's say there's an event with muscle-ups and it has 30 of them. We don't want to do 30 muscle-ups on Tuesday, but we'll probably do something that is sufficiently similar to help the athlete sort of sharpen up for that event. And then we'll probably do some high-intensity interval work. I like the bike for this most of the time, and it could be anything from like 1 minute on, 1 minute off intervals or 30 seconds. It kind of varies depending on athlete needs. But we want to do some type of high intensity interval conditioning. That'll probably be their last really high intensity session of the week. Wednesday, I try to have Wednesday be the travel day. Athlete check-in is on Thursday. I try to avoid having the athlete get there on that day. So ideally, the athlete travels on Wednesday. When they arrive, we'll do sort of an extended warm-up, especially if the athlete had a long sort of bout of travel. If they had a long day, we try to really make sure they loosen up. We'll do some low-impact event skill work. Here I'm thinking of stuff like light snatches or clean and jerks, handstand walking, anything that we know is not really going to impact the athlete, but that they'll feel good about practicing. And then we'll probably do some sort of moderate intensity sport and aerobic work. So sport work would be sport-specific training, but I'll usually mix it in. So an example might be if we want to work on pull-ups and handstand walk, maybe we'll do a 15-minute easy pace piece of like 500-meter row, 10 pull-ups, 20-foot handstand walk, or whatever. Keeping the volume low, again, avoiding things that make the athletes sore, avoiding things that tend to tear the hands, just to get them moving, get their heart rate up a bit. Finally, Thursday is the day that the athletes are going to check into the competition. So during or before that check-in, ideally, the athlete has access to the warm-up area. So we will use that warm-up area to do sort of an extended warm-up. Again, ideally with the specific equipment they'll be using. This means stuff like, if the athlete normally doesn't have access to the compact competition bars, the short bars, it's good to get them just to get a feel for something like that, or if there's an odd object like a sandbag, to get them feeling that equipment. And then we'll follow that up with a very easy 10 or so minute aerobic effort. We're talking zone 2 cardio, just get a little bit of a sweat going just so the athlete doesn't feel stiff the next day. Again, I like the bike for this, but rowing's fine, running's fine. If the event has a true form or a salt runner in it and the athlete doesn't normally have access to that, you definitely want to get them at least a little bit of time on that. Not too much, don't blow up their hamstrings, but you want to get them to feel it if they're not used to it. And then finally, a couple common mistakes I see in event prep and peaking. There's two big ones. The first is too much event practice. Regionals events are announced like 2 to 3 weeks out, and sometimes I see athletes who just, the last 3 weeks of regionals is nothing but event training, event training, event training, event training. That's not a great way to go about it. I feel it can lead to some burnout. It might lead to overuse injury. You want to do things like come up with variations of events so that the athlete is still practicing the relevant skills, but you want to change things in such a way that the athlete does not feel like they're going to burn out just doing event after event. The second big mistake I see is eliminating all normal training. So just because we're practicing for a specific event and we happen to know the events doesn't mean that the athlete shouldn't be doing anything else at all. I'd say the most important things to keep in are, one, relatively high intensity pieces that help to sustain the athlete's abilities in something. So for example, even if there's no really heavy squatting, I'll still probably have the athlete do like moderately heavy singles or doubles in the squat. They're not very high impact, they don't really fatigue the athlete, but they allow the athlete to keep their leg strength up, which is important, just because athletes will typically perform better if they feel like their legs are strong going into an event that is leg heavy, even if it doesn't have max effort leg strength involvement. That brings us to the second thing, which is you want to keep things that have the athlete's mental state at the forefront. So as an example, if an athlete tells you, hey, I always feel better snatching if once a week I do heavy snatch pulls, it's a good idea to keep something like that in because it's going to help the athlete go into the competition feeling sharp and peaked and knowing they're doing the things that are working for them. Don't eliminate that kind of stuff. Another example of that would be, my shoulders always feel better if I'm doing unilateral pressing work or some kind of accessory bodybuilding year-round. It's not really that impactful. It's not going to fatigue the athlete, but it might give them that sort of edge in the mental state where they arrive on game day feeling they've done everything right. They've done all the things that make them feel like the best athlete they can be the day that it matters the most. That's it for today, guys. Thank you so much for submitting your questions, and I'm sure I will see you guys on the RPCF group. Everybody have a good one.